Good afternoon and welcome to the third day of the first module. I'm going to continue with what I was doing yesterday in terms of identities and the politicization of sexuality, the difference between preference and identity I already explained, and now we are going to concentrate on identities. I explained yesterday and I put it down on the Word document that the principal identities in the post-war world, post-colonial world, post-modernist world comprise race, class, caste, gender, and sexual orientation. These are the principal identity categories today, all of which are, all of which are political and politicized and give us the politics of the personal. So the politics of the personal is made up broadly of these five identity categories. Now, I'm going to put down some more words on the Word document. We need to see how these different identities play off against each other, because all of us have more than one identity, in that all of us belong to some race and some class and caste and gender and sexual orientation. So all these identities obviously belong to individuals. But for many of us, it's one or two of these identities that we regard as our dominant identities, and other identities are less important. Nevertheless, the identities exist, and we need to see how they sort of play off against each other, because this enables one to decide overall, how empowered we are or disempowered we are, or to put it differently, whether we are, there's more of the oppressor in us than victims, or there's more of the victim in us than the oppressor. I think that, as I was saying yesterday, this is important for anybody who's been through university to have a sense of, where they are. So this politicization of identity is possible, by drawing up a binary. Now, there are people who say that, how about going beyond the binary? And Eve Sedgwick, whom I mentioned yesterday also, she actually quotes another very distinguished theorist, cultural theorist by the name of Roland Barthes, and says that, Roland Barthes talks about going beyond the binary, but that comes at a later stage. I'll just read what she has to say about Barthes, Roland Barthes. So she says it is premature, she calls it premature, meaning that it's not, the time isn't right yet to think of transcending the binary and going beyond it. So it's premature when Roland Barthes prophesies that, and this is a quote from Barthes, once the paradigm is blurred, utopia begins. Meaning and sex become the objects of free play, at the heart of which the forms and the sensual practices are liberated from what he calls the binary prison. So he, this business of binarizing is what Barthes considers to be a prison and not conducive to utopia, which is true, because the binary is a means to an end. The binary is a means to an end. Um, and the end, of course, is utopia. But, you know, utopias are not, they're elusive things, they're not realizable things. So there has to be a road to utopia, and the binary is one of those roads to utopia. So whether we like it or not, because, when Barthes calls it a binary prison, he's thinking of it as something that's too sort of narrow and reductive, and you know because people might say, well, can you really speak of identities in terms of just these four or five categories, and isn't it isn't the reality a little more complex than that? And that's fine. Nobody would disagree with that the reality is complex, and identities cannot just be mapped in terms of four or five things. But these are, as I said, in the post-war and post-colonial and post-modernist world, the main constituents of identity. And then, other things can be added. There are people who would talk of, human and animal, or you can talk about disability, being able-bodied and suffering from disability. So these are other categories that can and have been added. But the ones I mentioned yesterday are the main ones. Now, I gave you a hypothetical example yesterday and said that if someone were black in terms of race, poor in terms of class, um, non-male in terms of gender, and non-heterosexual in terms of sexual orientation, they would be, largely disempowered rather than empowered, because in terms of all the principal identity categories, they are on the victim side and not on the other side, on the side of empowerment. Um, whenever I discuss this, I'm reminded of a brilliant novel by an African American woman writer. Her name is Alice Walker, and the title of the novel is The Color Purple, which is also made into a film. So you want to catch the film if you can on Netflix or wherever, because it deals with a black woman lesbian character. So if you say black woman lesbian, then in most respects, a black woman lesbian. And invariably, a black lesbian woman is also poor. So, in terms of class, also there is victimhood and disempowerment. So that's the example I wanted to give. Now, I'm going to read what Sedgwick says, but before that, I'm going to put this word down on the Word document called intersectionality. Because this is a word that has gained a lot of traction in recent times. Intersectionality. Also, another I word, the word inclusiveness. Both these terms have gained currency in recent times. And intersectionality essentially has to do with, with seeing how these different identities play off against each other, and how coalitions of marginal people. Another way of looking at the binary. I gave you different ways of defining the binary. So it could be defined in terms of empowerment and disempowerment. It can be explained in terms of oppressor and victim, in terms of self and other. And yet another way of understanding the binary is to understand it in terms of mainstream and margin, right? So that everybody on the right-hand side of the binary column that you draw up is marginal, whereas everyone on the left hand side is part of the mainstream. So, intersectionality has to do with marginal people from across the different identity categories coming together, and coming together and forming a coalition, so that that becomes easier then to fight against the oppressor, rather than fighting in an isolated way, or fighting merely in terms of our individual constituencies. This is exactly what Sedgwick has a problem with, the gay movement. She's talking about the gay movement in America, of course, but she's trying to explain how um, the gay liberation movement has not learned lessons from the women's movement, because in the women's movement, according to Sedgwick, this business of forming coalitions with other marginal and oppressed people is there, but in the LGBT movement,
Because I got a message immediately.
Okay.
मैम दिख रहा है ना मेरे को? हाँ, it is.
Can I be heard now?
Yes, sir, you are audible now.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? Okay, that's good.
Yes, sir.
I it a little bit because I don't exactly know how much you lost from the Word document. You got that intersectionality and inclusiveness. And I was really talking about how the educated women in our society tends to mark both their deference to educated men and their expectation of deference from both the first part of the formulation has to do with
Actually, I see. phone.
You know
Check. Is this audible from you? Can somebody confirm?
Yes.
Yes.
Is this better?
Yes, it's better.
Yes.
All right. Very good.
So what
You can just speak.
there.
I'll fix this so that I'm.
I'm sorry about network issues are not in anybody's control. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right. So let me just read that again. A woman's use of a married name makes graphic at the same time her subordination as a woman and her privilege as a presumptive heterosexual. So, Mrs., which is a prefix that married women use, and they also use the surnames of their husbands and not of their fathers. We know that because that is universal throughout the world. In the women's movement, they have, they have found that they've resisted it and come up with the prefix Ms. MS, which does not reveal the marital status of a woman because it can be applied to both married and unmarried women. And then the other thing, apart from the prefix, is of course the woman taking the surname of her husband. In some cases in India, I'm sure some of you know this, even the first name of a married woman is changed, you know. Um, and this is symbolic. What is this supposed to mean? It's supposed to mean that the married woman now has to forget her um, previous identity, her unmarried identity, because now she is a different person. Now she's the wife of her husband, right? And she has to her previous identity has to be erased. So changing not just the surname but even the first name is a way of getting the woman to erase her premarital identity. However, if you look at sexuality as an identity category, then the married woman who uses the prefix Mrs. and takes the surname of her husband and even agrees to her first name being changed and being given a new name by the husband and his family is still on the side of privilege and empowerment and also oppression as far as sexual orientation is concerned, because the statement that she is making is that she's heterosexual, and that is why she's married. So is this clear? Have you understood this? These two examples provided by Sedgwick? Yes or no?
Sir, could you just repeat once again briefly?
You want me to read it or explain it?
The explanation.
Okay, so Sedgwick is looking at uh, three actually identity categories. In the first example that she provides, she's looking at class and gender, all right? And is giving us the example of an upper class educated woman who shows respect, who is respectful towards an upper class educated man, right? So here, the category in question, the identity category in question is gender. And she is showing deference or respect to the man, more deference and respect than the man would show to her. Because in terms of gender, right, it is the man who belongs to the empowered gender. So that is the first part of the formulation. The second part of the formulation here is that in turn, this educated woman, sorry, in turn, this educated woman would expect the same kind of deference or respect, that she gives to the educated man from both women and men of a lower class, that is to say, who are not as educated as she is. So here, the identity category in question is class, right? And in terms of class, the educated woman, if you take educated woman and um, not educated man, this is interesting because if you take educated woman versus not so educated man, let me give you the example of let me make this more concrete. A very familiar thing in India is that a lot of upper class educated women, have male drivers, right? Or male cooks. Male drivers is a better example. What is the equation between an upper class educated woman and her working class driver who's driving her throughout the day, taking her, she could be a corporate executive working in a big corporation or in a bank or whatever, could be in a university, could be a professor, a vice chancellor, could be a doctor, could belong to any of these white collar professions. And her driver in India, drivers are always invariably men and not women. So her driver, who belongs to the working class, is driving her night and day. What is the equation between them? Because in terms of class, clearly the woman belongs to the empowered class, and the driver belongs to the unempowered class. But in terms of gender, because the driver is a man, he belongs to the empowered gender, but the woman belongs to the unempowered gender. So is this example clear?
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Yes.
So when I use a term, when we use the term intersectionality, this is precisely what we mean, that there's an intersection that is taking place here. It's like there is a queer theorist. I'm forgetting her name right now. I wrote a long article in Caravan magazine a couple of months ago, and I quoted this because I found it interesting. She actually gives us the example of a traffic intersection, and she says that it's no different actually. These cultural and political intersections that we are talking about can be understood in terms of a literal traffic intersection, where traffic is coming from different directions, and if one is not careful, and if there's what she very interestingly says is that if there is an accident, it's very difficult to pin the blame, right? Who is at fault? Now we have cameras and all that, but even then it would be very difficult to exactly say that if there's an accident at an intersection, which driver coming from which direction is at fault. So here, in terms of cultural and political identity intersections, this is exactly what has to be figured out. Sedgwick's point is that in the LGBT subculture, this is not happening. It's not happening to her satisfaction, in that the LGBT subculture tends to look at their sexual orientation in isolation. Now, I will point out the reasons for this because, it's not as if in our subculture we are opposed to intersections, but it's just that I think that the LGBT subculture everywhere in the world meets with a hostility, from the other identity categories, so that intersectionality is, is a nice goal, but then we don't live in an ideal world, and when it comes to sexual minorities, there is always a hostility, and I'm going to talk about that at some length and, give you examples. But this is Sedgwick's first example. The second example is about a married woman, a woman's use of a married name. Again, simple example, Mrs. So-and-so. All right. Let me use an Indian name. Let me say that there is a Mrs. Desai. All right. Now, if you take gender as a category, okay, first let's take gender. There's this woman called Mrs. Desai. And in calling herself Mrs. Desai, Desai is the last name of her husband. Let's say her maiden name is Mrs. Kulkarni. Mrs. Kulkarni, after marriage, well, before marriage, she was Miss Kulkarni. After marriage, she becomes Mrs. Desai because that's the name of her husband, right? So, does her husband have to change his name? No. Does he have to change his prefix? No. He's still Mr. Kulkarni. He's still Mr. Desai. He doesn't become um, Mr. Kulkarni, which is her name. So he doesn't take her name. I think even in matriarchal societies, I don't think that men take their wife's name, but she has to take her name. So it means that in terms of gender, she is unempowered or disempowered, whereas he is empowered. Now, if we take the same example and think of sexual orientation as an identity category, in calling herself Mrs. Desai, what is this woman saying to someone who's a lesbian? This woman is saying to someone who's a lesbian that, well, I am heterosexual. And that is why I am a married woman, married to my husband, Mr. Desai, whereas you are a lesbian, and therefore you can't be a Mrs. whatever name you want to use, even if you desire to, because you're a lesbian. Lesbian marriages are not recognized, and the lesbian will not marry a man. So, in terms of sexual orientation, the Mrs. Desai is empowered. But in terms of gender, Mrs. Desai is unempowered. So, if you take, if you're thinking of the intersection in this case of gender and sexual orientation, where is, where do you locate Mrs. Desai? You get my point?
Yes,
Can
sir.
you hear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Can you hear me? So during question time, we can take this up if you want. But so the point is that in in the intersection of gender and sexual orientation, where do you locate Mrs. Desai? In the earlier example, in the intersection of gender and class, where do you locate this upper class woman? I gave you I gave you a concrete example and said this upper class woman who has a working class man who's driving her morning to evening. So that is what Sedgwick is really saying, that this is important. So, the point that Sedgwick is making is that intersectionality is important. And I can tell you, like I just said, that this word in recent times has gained a lot of traction. You go to seminars, you go to conferences. I was in Germany a couple of years ago, and everybody bandies these words about, Parmesh Shahni's book, Queeristan, which is the subtitle is LGBT inclusion in the workplace. Yeah, the other word is inclusion or inclusiveness, okay, which is similar to intersectionality. And Parmesh Shahni's book, which is on your reading list, Queeristan, is also, well, the word inclusion is used in the subtitle itself, but it's also used in the book in across different chapters. So this has become a kind of catchword, um, and it is good. It is good that it has become a catchword. But the point is that is it merely theoretical, or does it have, as far as the LGBT subculture is concerned, does it really make a difference to us in practice, or is it merely theoretical? Because I think that exactly as Sedgwick does over here, fingers tend to be pointed at the LGBT subculture by the other identity categories, who tell us that, well, you guys look at your sexual orientation in isolation, And if you're going to look at it in isolation, then it's of no interest to us because we are heterosexuals, right? So then your agendas are of no interest to us. But if you're able to sort of bond with us and look at it in terms of a coalition, then maybe we can put up a fight against the oppressive mainstream, the heteronormative, heterosexual mainstream together, right? But the point is that this tends to be theoretical. And this is where I'm going to give you examples from each of these categories to show you how there has actually been, over the decades, there's been a kind of a stepmotherly attitude towards sexual minorities. I'll give you the first example I'll give you is from race as an identity category. Way back in the 1980s, there was a book that was published in America. The title of the book is A Lotus of Another Color. And then it has a subtitle. But the main title of the book is A Lotus of Another Color. This book, A Lotus of Another Color, is made up of testimonies, entirely made up of testimonies by South Asian lesbian and gay and maybe transgender immigrant people who live in the West, mainly in America. Okay, so let me repeat that. It's made up of testimony. You know what's a testimony? It's stories of their own life, not fiction, but personal stories of their own life. As gay, lesbian, or transgender immigrant people of South Asian origin who live in America or England or Canada, right? Mainly, this is actually about those who live in America. By extension, you can include England and Canada as well, but it's mainly about America. And you also know what South Asia. South Asian region is, of course, India and its immediate neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, etc. All that comprises the South Asian region. So it's by the South Asian diaspora people who are gay and lesbian. And without exception, because I read the book when I first got it, when it was published, I have used some of those testimonies in other things that I happen to write and so on, because I find it a very useful book. And without exception, all the testimonies are lamenting one universal fact, and that is that if you are of South Asian origin and are gay and lesbian and living in America, your ethnic or racial identity and your sexual identity are always in conflict with each other, and you get it from both sides. Let me explain what I mean by getting it from both sides. You get it from your own ethnic people, comprising your parents, relatives, people of the South Asian diaspora community who very often form ghettos, right? Because the ghetto then becomes a survival tactic. You get it from them because what they say to you is that, well, you can't be openly gay or lesbian or trans because you are of South Asian or Indian origin, and this is against our culture, right? So you cannot allow, the mainstream culture of America, which means white people's culture. You cannot allow it to influence you, and so you look at them and say, well, they can be openly homosexual and lesbian, so why can't we? But their culture is different and ours is different, and you cannot forget your ethnicity, your origins, your Indianness. Even if you're second generation diaspora, meaning you were born there, even then you can't forget. Your loyalty first has to be to your own racial and ethnic identity and not to your sexual identity. So you must suppress your sexual identity to the extent that, many of their parents would say, well, if you have to get married, right? You can't come out, you have to, even if you're out of the closet. Yesterday I talked about the closet. You may be out of the closet, or you preferably should be in the closet, because Indian culture, this will come up later. Indian culture is a shame culture, meaning that my sexuality is not just my business. It is the business of my family. It is the business of the community. It is everybody else's business. And my sexuality can shame the family and the community, right? And then it becomes my duty to see that on account of my sexuality, I don't shame my family and my community, because otherwise that would be selfishness on my part to do so. Yesterday, I gave you the example of how a lot of LGBT people in the subculture are told, by their families that, okay, you want to come out of the closet and lead an openly gay or lesbian lifestyle, but think of your brothers and sisters. They will not find husbands and wives, because we will be ridiculed by people in the community, people in our social and ethnic and cultural circle. And so, should you be doing that, and so on? So, this is what the writers who, the contributors to that book, Lotus of Another Color, say as far as their racial and ethnic identities are concerned. But then they say that if some of them are willing to defy their families and the community and say that, it's my life, and after all, I'm living in America and not in India, and I was born here, so who are you to dictate to me, because America is an individualist culture and I'm going to be part of that. And if they say that, there is still a difficulty that they face, and that is that the queer mainstream, okay? So now we are using sexual orientation as an identity category. And the queer mainstream in America would be made up of mainly European Americans or white Americans, right? And they are also unwilling to accept us, as part of that subculture or that community, because of our skin color. So, as far as race is concerned and ethnicity is concerned, our sexual orientation comes in the way of acceptance. And as far as sexual orientation is concerned, it's the opposite. That is, our race and our skin color come in the way of acceptance. So then we become dangling men and dangling women. We are neither here nor there, right? So then if you use the word intersectionality, you can see that intersectionality becomes a sort of theoretical proposition, that in theory it's fine, but in practice, this is the conflict that sexual minorities who belong to the South Asian diaspora say that they face, which is that both groups of people are unwilling to accept them and allow them to assimilate and be a part of, of their communities. This is one example that I wanted to state. Then the other thing, the other category that one needs to importantly, let me also talk about class before I talk about gender, because I think gender is the most complicated when it comes to this business of intersectionality. Since we have multiple genders and so on, the word intersectionality is easier said than actually done. But let me also talk about caste, not class so much, but caste. Now, caste is something that exists in Hinduism and not in other religions. It may exist in other religions in a loose sort of way, but it wouldn't really be caste. It would be class. And there's a fundamental difference between caste and class, and that is that in the case of class, you can be upwardly mobile in terms of class. But in terms of caste, caste is a very deterministic thing, because if you're born to a certain caste, then no matter how hard you try, you can't really, there is no upward mobility possible. There is no mobility in any direction that is possible. Whereas with class, mobility is possible. In fact, that is the meaning of the American dream, by the way. This term American dream, which was first used, I think it was James Adams who used it in 1931. Why do people flock to America? Because of the idea of the American dream. Simply put, what the American dream is that, if you have what it takes in terms of skill, in terms of the willingness to work hard and so on, then other things don't come in the way and you can succeed and you can be at the top. Of course, this is only partly true and partly untrue because, again, if you look at testimonies by African Americans and Black people, they would say that, is this really true? You mean there's no racial discrimination? Is racial discrimination in America a thing of the past? You know that in 2020, at the height of the lockdown and the pandemic, what happened to this unfortunate man called George Floyd, as a result of which Trump lost the election, actually, and thankfully so. But, so it hasn't gone, and non-white people in America have asked this question that, is the American dream only a myth or is it real? But it is a concept that exists, right? Because that's what America, as part of the new world, supposed to represent. It doesn't have the burden of tradition, unlike Europe and take India, for example. Tradition becomes a burden because that's always thrown at you, and you'll be told that we are a 5,000-year-old civilization, and why do we need to change things and so on. So America is free of that, and that is what the American dream, the phrase American dream signifies, right? So what was I saying? I was talking about the Indian diaspora. I was talking about how class mobility is, at least theoretically, possible. In actual practice also it's possible, in that it's not as if Black people in America haven't succeeded. Many have made it to Hollywood. At one time, Denzel Washington was rated to be the most handsome Hollywood actor. So there are people in industry. There are Black writers like Toni Morrison, who won the Nobel Prize. So it's not as if that mobility doesn't exist, but it doesn't universally exist. Now, in the case of caste, mobility is completely ruled out because caste is fixed. You can't, if you're born to a certain caste, you have to die in that caste. You can't change. You can't convert. You can even convert from one religion to another, interestingly, but you can't convert from one caste to another. This is what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar realized, and that is why changed his religion, because there was no other way in which he could liberate. He was highly educated. He went to Columbia University in the city of New York to study law, and yet he would be seen as a as a member of the Mahar community to which he was born, right? Arun Shourie, a man like Arun Shourie, has this book, I think, which is very critical of Ambedkar. The title of the book is Worshipping False Gods and so on. So you can see that is the attitude, even to a man like Ambedkar. And Ambedkar, as the architect of the Constitution, I can ask a further question. I'm digressing a little bit, but it's fine, because this is culture critique also in a way. But do we respect the Constitution today that that he authored? We don't, and it could be that it is because it's Ambedkar who authored it that we don't even care about it that much, and we just sort of. I was seeing this um, show which Cyrus Brocha does on every Saturday, and it's a spoof on political goings on in the country. And on Republic Day, he had a show, and so someone said, on 26 January 1950, we adopted the Constitution, and on 26 January 2022, we have adapted, adapt. That is to say, we have tampered with it and changed it. And this was what somebody said, and then Brocha, as the anchor, says, "Oh, shut up! You can't say controversial things on my show," and so on. But that is it, So the fixity of caste. Now, I was talking about intersections, and I wanted to give you the example of many people in the Dalit community, whom I have heard say that there are no homosexuals in the Dalit community. And that is one of the reasons why in my own novel, The Boyfriend, I decided to use a Dalit character based actually on someone I really know, who is from the Dalit community and homosexual. So this denial, that our community is sacrosanct and homosexuality is a bad thing, and therefore we don't want to acknowledge that there are homosexuals or trans people and so on in the Dalit community. Now, this is the hostility, because if that is, and this can also be called homophobia. We are going to be talking about homophobia later. But if that is the case, how can there be intersectionality, right? So I gave you the example of race, and I gave you the example of caste. Put the case that there is a homosexual man who is born in one of the Dalit communities of India. What does he do? He is in all likelihood, even in my novel, The Boyfriend, Milan's family, Milan is the Dalit character, forces him to get married. He has no option. So in all probability, there may be, and there are, of course, homosexuals in the Dalit community, but they would be told to remain in the closet. That would be the advice that would be given to them. They would be told that they can't come out of the closet and lead openly gay lives because it would shame the community, and they would have to, follow the norms of the community in terms of. And if they want to fight, the fight that they would put up would be against caste and not against sexual orientation. They can be activists, but they would have to be activists who fight for the rights of Dalit people and not for the rights of homosexual people. So that part would have to be completely sort of swept under the carpet and and suppressed. So that's the second example. Now the third example, gender. Gender, as I said, is the most complicated when it comes to this business of intersectionality, because even within the women's movement, non-heterosexual women and trans people have faced a lot of flack from women, let alone from men, let alone from people of other classes and castes. But even from women, if you take gender as a category, so even from women, lesbians and trans people have faced a lot of flack. And several examples can be given over here. It is well known that let's take lesbianism first, and then we'll come to transgender people. Let's take lesbianism first. Eve Sedgwick, talking about America, says that it was much better in the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was a time, when this bonding, okay, female bonding was so strong that whether one was heterosexual or lesbian did not matter. What mattered was that one is a woman, right? So much so, one of the catchphrases of the time became the following, that feminism is the theory and lesbianism is the practice. Lesbianism, even, um, they began to see lesbianism as the applied side of feminist theory, which is to say, and which makes a lot of sense actually. If you ask me, the lesbian feminism is a school of feminism. I also talked about political lesbianism the other day, but it's a school of feminism. But the way I see it, and feminists might, want to kill me for saying this, and they might say I'm totally idiotic for saying this. But the way I see this is that, to the extent that feminists who are heterosexual depend on men for sexual gratification cannot but be taken to be a compromise, because to that extent they are codependent on men for sexual pleasure, right? So, whereas with lesbian feminists, even that codependence on men isn't there. So they can be full-fledged feminists who can completely sort of do away with men in all respects, right? They can just sort of have a women's commune, and in fiction, there's a lot of feminist women who experiment with it. I'll give you two examples. Manju Kapoor's novel Married Woman, Manju Kapoor is a well-known contemporary novelist who writes in English. Her novel Married Woman, if you get a chance to read it, many of the examples I'll be giving you are from literature and cinema, because I'm basically a professor of literature. But then, everything is very interdisciplinary, so we just don't talk only about literature, but we also talk about things like LGBT issues. At least that is what I do. But in Manju Kapoor's novel, Married Woman, the title is Married Woman, so this woman is married, but it's a bad marriage. She walks out of this marriage, and then she has this relationship with another woman, a lesbian relationship with a younger woman, which turns out to be much more satisfactory than the relationship that she had with her husband, which led to a separation or a divorce or whatever. So this is Manju Kapoor. Likewise, there is a John Updike novel called S, which I teach, and where this American woman, Sarah, S stands for Sarah. It's a novel about this woman, Sarah Worth, fiction. And she walks out on her husband and joins a commune in Oregon, in America. And actually, that's modeled on the Osho commune, of our own Osho. And she was married, she has a daughter and all that. But once she is in this commune again, she has a very satisfying lesbian relationship with another woman who's also in the commune. So that's the second example. The third example is this film Fire, which you should see, where in a middle-class household in Delhi, both these sisters-in-law who are married to the two brothers in the family, are sort of not in satisfactory marital relationships with their husbands for different reasons. And then they turn to each other and have a very satisfactory romantic and sexual and emotional relationship with each other, which is how the movie ends. They both walk out on their husbands, and they're not cured or anything. They're not made to, they're not shown to regret what they've done, and and apologize and so on, and promise to be good wives. Nothing of the sort. They walk out on their husbands and decide to spend the rest of their lives together. So, this is how lesbianism then becomes liberating for women who did not start out as lesbians. They started out as heterosexual women. Now, you might say, sir, but what is their true sexuality? Now, that I've already told you, that sexuality exists on a spectrum. Most people are somewhere in between the spectrum. So it's not difficult to have sex with either gender or all genders. It's not, you shouldn't see it in this either or way. That if you're married, then how can you also be lesbian? Some of you might be intrigued by questions like that, and you can ask me if you want. But I gave you the example yesterday of this college lecturer in a small town in Maharashtra, who came to my office and said, sir, even I have this problem. But then he told me about himself, and he said he was married and he had children and so on. So what is his sexuality? Is he heterosexual? Is he It reminds me of that Kamala Das poem where she is introspecting and saying, am I homosexual? Am I lesbian? Am I heterosexual? So I think that, we are all, we are all different things at the same time or at different times. But the point is that in the women's movement, there has been a hostility to lesbianism, and this movie Fire that I mentioned, when there were protests against the movie when it came out by the Shiv Sena, and they wanted it banned because they said you can't show lesbianism on the screen and so on. There were counter protests by women's groups in Delhi, at Jantar Mantar or somewhere. And when the lesbians also attended these counter protests with their own placard and wanted to join the morcha that they were taking out, they were, they were cold-shouldered. They were told that they were sort of hijacking the protest and diluting it, because there are many women in the women's movement who feel that, somewhere they have this feeling that homosexuality and lesbianism are not important in the Indian socio-cultural context, that they are not Indian things, that they've come from the West, and that there are very few people who are affected by it, or who can, who are out of the closet, who want to lead openly gay and lesbian lives. So they feel that when you talk about the women's movement, they think that there are other issues that must be addressed and not sexuality. And if sexuality is also brought into the discourse, then it will only dilute and even trivialize, the discourse. This is what many women in the women's movement, think, even as I speak. Number one. Likewise, when it comes to trans women, there are mainstream feminists, heterosexual feminists in the women's movement who have argued that trans women cannot really be a part of our movement, because trans women are not women in the sense in which we are women, right? They are not women from the time they are born, right? Their birth gender is not female. Their cisgender, that is not female. They have transitioned and become female. But on the contrary, their cisgender is male. And if their cisgender is male and their early years has, they've been sort of socially, psychologically, and so on, been brought up as boys and not as girls, then they can't see things the way we, whose cisgender is female, and from the very start we were brought up as girls, psychologically, socially, culturally, and so on, are different. Our ways of seeing are different from their ways of seeing, and therefore they can't really be included in the women's movement. So this is where both in terms of lesbianism and in terms of trans women, there is a kind of hostility to admit them into the women's movement. And if that is the case, how can we really talk about intersectionality? How can we? And I forgot to say that when Sedgwick said that feminism is the theory and lesbianism is the practice in the 1970s in America, what do you think changed that? Sedgwick has an answer to this, an explanation. She said what changed that in the 1980s was the arrival of AIDS and HIV. Now, AIDS and HIV was affecting, when it first made its appearance in America, it was affecting gay men and not women. It was gay men who were dying literally like flies. If you read Abraham Varghese book, My Own Country, it's a very moving account of how he is a doctor of Indian origin who was born in Ethiopia and then settled down in America in the state of in the city of Johnson in the state of Tennessee, which is a very Christian part of the US, and specialized in infectious diseases, and suddenly found all these homosexual men coming to his clinic one by one with a high fever and so on, and just within no time, dropping down dead. That's what his book is about. He also went to the international writing program in Iowa, which I also later went to, and that's how he became a writer, apart from being a doctor. And this is his first book, My Own Country. You should check it out. I hope that the books and the films I'm mentioning, of course, this is being recorded, but make a note of it somewhere so that if you really want to make the most of this certificate course, on your own, you can access this material that I'm talking about. But he points out how it was an infection, a disease, when it first appeared, and no one even knew what it was. This is early 1980s, that affected homosexual men. There was not a single lesbian, who really died of AIDS or HIV or even contracted it. And yet, it was enough. The advent of AIDS was enough for heterosexual feminists to say to the lesbians, show the lesbians the door and say, well, I think that AIDS introduced at the time in America the concept of the pervert. Okay, so you guys through perversion have brought this pandemic. The AIDS pandemic at the time was similar to COVID now, except that it affected not the whole world as COVID has affected the whole world, but it affected people who did not practice safe sex. And that was how it was. But the point I'm making is that, as Sedgwick shows us in her book, if in the 70s lesbians were welcomed with open arms by the women's movement, what is it that changed in the 80s? And the answer is that AIDS changed everything. And then they were sort of kept at a distance and said that you are, you're no different from gay men. So gay men, gay women, gayness became suspect, right? Heterosexuality. And then, AIDS spread, it came to India as well. The writing on the wall, I mean, in those days, you travel by train, you saw on the wall, the people crude kinds of statements, slogans on the wall and so on about only having sex with your wife and not sleeping around, not being promiscuous and so on. So when Ashok Rao Kavi talks to you, he started Humsafar, and then a lot of the work that Humsafar Trust, NAS Foundation, apart from fighting to change the law and all that, and filing writ petitions, but they were also doing a lot of outreach work, like distributing condoms and educating people about, the need to use protection and so on. So that became a major agenda of all the support groups in India and elsewhere in the world as well. But this hostility, right, that lesbians as well as trans women faced from the uh, women in the women's movement, you know, in the women's movement, the women in the women's movement were already marginal and not mainstream, because what they were fighting against was, or fighting for, was gender equality, gender parity with men. And yet, over here, they had created a further hierarchy between themselves and lesbians and trans women. So, where is the question then of intersectionality? So, when this word is bandied about today, and like I said, I've gone to several seminars and heard this word intersectionality, and that's fine. Inclusiveness is fine, but is it hypothetical? Is it theoretical? Is it a myth, or does it really exist in practice when it comes to the LGBT subculture? And like I was saying yesterday, one of the things that goes against us is that our agenda, our constituency, has to do with sex. Sex and morality are interlinked. It's very difficult for people to de-link the two, because if you de-link the two, then you get the sense that you're not even, then the question that will be put to you is that if you de-link the two, what is the difference between human beings and animals? But that's not the right question to ask, because you can de-link the two without being animals, and moreover, animals are part of the natural world. So why, what's the harm in even asking that question? I think that in terms of identities, animal rights today has become also a sort of constituency. And I'm thinking of poems by Walt Whitman, where he says, I'd rather live with the animals and so on. Or George Orwell's novel Animal Farm, which is using the fable in order to make a comment on totalitarianism and so on. So this delinking of religion and of sex and morality is necessary, but since that is easier said than done, when it comes to intersectionality, the other identities, racial, class, caste, gender, don't have these close links with the idea of morality. But sexual orientation is linked, because sex and morality are linked. And this is the stumbling block, I would say, that comes in the way of intersectionality. So when Sedgwick laments, she says, I'll just read that before I finish. She says, we are by now very used to asking as feminists what we aren't used to asking as anti-homophobic readers, namely how a variety of forms of oppression intertwine systemically with each other, and how the person who is disabled through one set of oppressions may be, by the same positioning, enabled through others. And then she says further, just as the last thing I'll read and then open it up for discussion, that one is either oppressed or an oppressor, or that if one happens to be both, the two are not likely to have much to do with each other, still seems to be a common assumption. However, at any rate, male gay writing and activism, as it hasn't for a long time been in careful feminist work. I'll stop there and let's open it for discussion.
Sir, so I have a question. So, when you talk about like delinking of sex and morality, I feel that's very difficult. And also in recent discourses, recent times, like when we talk of pride and if kink can be a part of pride, then the debate again come up of like how sex is linked with morality, and it also brings in the earlier notions of like perversion, as you talked about, or deviance attached to certain sexualities and identities. So, what can be a way around dealing both of these, especially when we talk of kink at pride parades or exposing children to such, like not in my language, but in the language of conservatives or other people, like exposing children to like deviant form of sexualities and other similar identities.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no easy solution because it also depends on, when you invoke a term like morality, then you're also thinking of religion, right? And how do you sort of, it's a tightrope walk because if you're overly moral and maybe you're also overly religious, how do you tie that up with your sexual orientation, if your sexual orientation is, any of the non-heterosexual sexualities? This was a problem that Jonathan Dollimore's book, Sexual Dissidence, opens. The first chapter is very anecdotal because it talks about two writers, Oscar Wilde and André Gide, who are very different from each other in this respect, in that for Oscar Wilde, this link between sex and morality and so on did not exist. So he was radical and he suffered as a result of it. Of course, he was in prison because homosexuality was illegal in the 19th century in England. And he even died of the torture inflicted on him in jail. But the other writer is the French writer André Gide, who was homosexual but also deeply Christian. So that for him, there was even an unwillingness to be a practicing homosexual. That anecdotal chapter talks about how Wilde and Gide met in a foreign country in Algiers, in North Africa. And Wilde, Gide knew that Wilde would sort of tempt him, to go and have sex with male prostitutes and so on. He tried his best to avoid him. He tried to check out of the hotel before Oscar Wilde got to that hotel. And yet he couldn't do it. Their paths crossed. And sure enough, Oscar Wilde tempted him to have sex with this Muslim sex worker in the red light district. And while having sex, André Gide said he was in a state of bliss and on the top of the world and enjoyed every minute of it. But the moment it was over, he says he was overcome with guilt because his Christian self was in conflict with what he had just done. And then he wrote a letter to his mother and said that, Wilde is the incarnation of the devil and so on. And so this conflict, between being deeply Christian and being homosexual. Now, there is no easy answer. How do you de-link? And I would say that, radical LGBT ideas, therefore, usually come from a leftist perspective because, the political left, communism, Marxism, and so on are anyway distanced from religion. Marx said religion is the opium of the people and so on. So if you come from that perspective, it's easier to negotiate. But if you're coming from a right-wing perspective, then it becomes harder. How do you de-link? Because what people like Devdutt Patnaik and all do, even Ruth Manita to some extent, is okay. You go to the mythology and use that as evidence. If you read Ruth Manita's book and Devdutt Patnaik, Shikandini sex change operation, or you can talk about the famous example I keep giving of Aravan, Krishna transforming into a woman and becoming Aravan's wife for one night, which is celebrated as the Kovagam festival in Pondicherry every year, even now, where Hijras go and become brides for one night. Or even stories like Vishnu and Shiva, having sex and having a child out of that sex who's called Ayappa, So then you can cite And Ruth Vanita also, this is even controversial because she cites passages from the Bhagavad-Gita. She says that she doesn't mean that Krishna is homosexual, but she says that, she sort of underlines the passages where Krishna says that I love Arjuna more than my wife. Arjuna is dearer to me than my wife. And she says that, there's an emotion over here. So all these examples are given. Devdutt Patnaik has spent his life, writing books, and he's a best-selling author. He's the only one who you see on mainstream media like TV. None of us is ever called. Nobody would call me to say these things on TV, but he's always there on CNN and so on. He's the voice of, and he keeps on giving these examples that this one was this one was that, this one. So that's how they do it. But at the end of the day, I think that you have to negotiate this for yourself. You have to maybe spend a lifetime thinking about it and coming to the conclusion that you can still be, to the extent that the term moral means good or truthful or whatever, you can be homosexual and still be moral, right? And you can be homosexual in the sense in which I used the term even earlier, you can be polyamorous. You don't have to be homonormative, right? So homonormative deriving from heteronormativity, so married, I stay faithful to my partner, I'm monogamous, I don't look at other people. You needn't even do that. You can have a lifestyle that is more in conformity with the queer subculture and yet not necessarily be immoral. It's a tightrope walk. You negotiate for yourself. That's my answer to your question. But you're right. There's no formula. I can't give you a formula.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah. In English, the word promiscuity has negative connotation. So if I say promiscuity, I may have used that term. I may have used it ironically. Because what that connotes is that you just sort of sleep around and, you have anonymous sex. Ruth Vanita, I read that quote. She uses the term anonymous sex, which means that I just sleep around with anybody and everybody, and that's devoid of emotions, and there's no love, there's no commitment, there's no stability in those encounters and so on. Free sex, if you like, orgies. That's what the word promiscuity connotes. But what I really meant was, the idea of being polyamorous, okay, which is that you can have committed relationships with which are non-monogamous. The idea of commitment and monogamy seem to go hand in hand in the heterosexual mainstream, and that is what can be contested in the LGBT subculture. That's the point I was making. And many of us, because then you'll say, what's the evidence? So then all I will have to say is that many of us have lived our own lives that way. So our own lives then are the evidence. In a certificate course, in an academic environment, you can't be anecdotal. But I can tell you this much, that in my case, and in any writer's case, fiction is not pure imagination or pure invention. Fiction has a basis in reality. If you take the trouble to read I would call it my trilogy, there are four actually. The Boyfriend, Hostel Room 131, Lady Lolita's Lover, and my short story collection, Crocodile Tears. Okay, these four books. You will get an inkling of the kind of life I've lived. All these are works of fiction. So it's not straight autobiography. Many things are imagined, invented, And as a writer, I'm not going to say how much of it is real and how much is made up. But this much I can say, that you'll get a fair idea. So that, what is important to me is that the man who's speaking to you here is not just talking through his hat and making all these uh, theoretical statements which are very difficult to incorporate in actual practice. So I think that many of us have done it. And the other day, when we had this opening webinar, I was very happy to hear both Ashok and Shobna endorsing this idea of polyamorousness. I think it's well known. I have this Australian poet friend, Catherine Amal, and we were traveling somewhere, and this discussion came up, and she said that the heterosexual mainstream, if there's one thing they need to learn from the LGBT subculture, it is about polyamorousness. The idea that you can simultaneously love several people together without without it leading to bitterness and jealousy and all that. So that's what I meant. I would say that the preferable term is not promiscuity, because it's a word that has negative connotations, but if we can use terms like polyamorousness, they have less negative connotations. But that's what I meant. So I hope I've answered your question. I said that that is something that you see in the LGBT subculture all over the world, which is not what the idea of a traditional heterosexual marriage even acknowledges. In the heterosexual marriage, you have concepts like unfaithfulness, fidelity, infidelity, adultery. You have those things. In a way, I'm also saying that those terms, those concepts don't exist in the LGBT subculture. Just say that. Just read that again, please. Right. So in terms of gender, the married woman is no. In terms of sexual orientation, the married woman is empowered because she's by taking the surname of her husband and using the prefix Mrs. is making a statement about her heterosexuality, right? And then in terms of what was the other category? So in terms of sexual orientation, the married woman is the empowered one. Is that clear? And then just ask her if that is clear.
Yes, sir.
And then in terms of gender, again, the married woman is privileged because because you're giving the example of the married woman vis-a-vis her husband, not vis-a-vis the lesbian, vis-a-vis the husband. The married woman is, of course, on the side of unempowerment or disempowerment. She's a victim there because she is married and she's taken her husband's name and he hasn't taken her name. So there she's, that's exactly the example that Sedgwick gives, isn't it? That there she is unempowered, but when it comes to sexual orientation as an identity category in relation to a lesbian, she is empowered. So then there is a clash of identities. This is what intersectionality is about. So finally, where is she? Right?
Yes, sir. Thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
yeah.
Intersectionality is distinct and whereas the eagle fight found on related that the such movement always I of in furthering the right, especially
Yeah, but like I explained, the LGBT community, I think, is pushed into a corner. We are pushed into Eve Sedgwick's point that we tend to look at our agendas in isolation can be, can be answered by pointing out that's the examples I gave, that whether it's racial minorities or women or Dalits, they're unwilling to admit us into the coalition. The earlier word was coalition. They are unwilling to admit us into the coalition. So, what can the LGBT community do except, fight in isolation, right? I wanted to give, I was thinking while coming here, on the way that, explain this in terms of our national politics. So the mainstream is like the BJP, and the marginal identities are like all our opposition parties from Trinamool Congress and Samajwadi Party, Shiv Sena, NCP, the AIDMK, and so on. And now this has been going on constantly. That why can't all these opposition parties come together and put up a fight against the BJP and defeat them in the next general election? But is that really possible? Every day, even yesterday, I read that the Trinamool, now they're saying they can't be an opposition without the Congress in it because it's a large national party. But the Trinamool Congress has problems with the Congress. Some other parties have problems with some other parties. So there's no unified opposition. And national politics, this is one of the big problems in India, that we don't have a unified opposition. If we did, then many of the things that were happening in this country wouldn't have happened. But unfortunately, we don't. So it's likewise over here when we are talking about cultural politics and personal politics, that each constituency tends to look at its agendas in isolation. The same conflict exists between the caste minorities and women, gender minorities, right? A Dalit woman, where would you place a Dalit woman? Would you, actually um, the women's bill has always, had this issue with what do you do about Dalit women? I mean, do you see them as Dalits first, or do you see them as women first? And I was teaching literary criticism, and there's this wonderful essay that the two professors wrote, which point out that this whole business of, where feminists like Nivedita Menon talk about inclusion, but then Sharmila Rege, who passed away, she was in my university, the head of the Women's Studies Center. Renu, you must have heard of her, Sharmila Rege. And she, she explains this, that for Dalit women, you can't talk about inclusion because mainstream upper class feminists will not, admit them into the whole paradigm, and so they have to fight for their rights separately. Dalit women, tribal women, for example. So, does inclusiveness really work over there when it comes to these two identity categories of caste and gender, right? So the premise or the conclusion that I can draw from this is that intersectionality is a admirable goal, but it's easier said than done. And in actual practice, there are a number of hurdles that are faced when you talk about coalitions and you talk about the need for intersectionality.
Thank you, sir.
Someone may just read that latter part. Someone may be what? I still didn't get that word. Maybe a what? Victim. But what do you mean by perspective? What you're saying is that, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that there are people who are not aware of their identity. Now, if that's the case, then what can be done? They need to be educated. What you call different perspective is what I would call lack of education. There are a lot of people who are not, there are a lot of women who would say we are happy being subordinate to our husbands, we are happy being subservient. There are a lot of women who would say that. And they're not part of the women's movement. But then that's not a different perspective. That's just, according to me, that's faulty education. It's possible that they have not, because education is privilege. You have to be, when I say education, I don't mean basic education, I mean higher education, university education. And that, of course, requires one to be privileged to be able to invest in it in terms of time and money. And if one is not, then of course that's unfortunate. And that is when the state has to step in. But the state doesn't. The state, in this country, the state cannot see beyond uh, basic education. I can tell you that. As a university professor of 43 years, the state can't see beyond, beyond basic education. If you've done 10th and 12th, that's it, you're educated. Higher education, all our departments are languishing, their positions are not filled. They don't care. Look at my department, English department of Pune University. Read my novel, Madam, Give Me My Sex, which is a roman de clerk actually. After I retired, I decided to write this. A department that had such a glorious tradition at one time when it was started in the 1960s. And look at its sorry state today. They don't have faculty. They are doing with, former students who have just passed out. This course, LGBT studies, which I started and which was very successful. And initially we had opposition, and then we won the fight, and I taught it for a number of years. Is now purposely being taught by somebody, a former student, who came to me and said, "Sir, I don't know anything about this subject, but because students wanted, they told me to come and teach it." So this is the sorry state of affairs of a lot of departments and universities. And it is, I would say, the responsibility of the state, to see that positions are filled and students are given fee waivers and so on to educate them. But what you call a different perspective is not it's not a well thought out perspective or anything of that sort. It's just ignorance. It's just being co-opted by tradition and uh, not being able to think these things through on your own, and not having the right kind of exposure, in terms of ideas, in terms of the books you read, the films you see, and so on. That's what it is. Yeah. Position. Jaspir Puar is an Indian. She uses the term homo nationalism and so on, but this is not by her. She's also referred to in the same book, which I reviewed for Caravan magazine. This is called Out of Time by Rahul Rao. But it's an American who used this term, and tomorrow I'll give you the reference. I'm forgetting the critic's name, but I found that analogy very interesting, because she says that when you talk about these identity intersections, it's exactly like traffic intersection. The point that she was trying to make is that if there is a collision at a traffic intersection, it's very hard to pin the blame and, say who's at fault. So likewise, in these intersections, who is in these identity intersections that we are talking about, who is right and who is wrong. For example, mainstream feminists saying that trans women are not real women or lesbians are not to be a part of the women's movement. Who is right, who is wrong, is very difficult to decide. Thank you. Now I will see you, of course, after 2 weeks, right? So today is what? Third. After 12 days. 1.5 weeks.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you, everyone, for patiently listening and helping us getting over with the technical issues. Sorry for the inconvenience that we all faced. And before we will leave for the day, I would like to just brief you for the next week. Shivani ma'am will be updating, putting the next week calendar for you all. And next week we have Mr. Kanav. He's from Legal Policy and Research. And we have 2 sessions on mental and developmental health by psychiatrist Dr. Anagha Jog and Dr. Kaustubh Jog, who are working with IPH, Institute of Psychological Health. And Kanav is working with Vidhi Center for Legal Policy and Research. So we are looking forward to meet you all once again next week. And as I said, we will be sharing the week calendar with you all. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.